and welcome to Dregs of Wisdom with Andrew Tanner.
All right, welcome everyone. Episode 4, Dregs of Wisdom. Today we're going to continue our foray into the Tao Te Ching. We'll be covering verse 2, which brings about 3 very important topics. The first is the concept of yin and yang and the relativity between them. The second is the concept of wu wei, or non-action, and how we can move mountains through non-action. And then the final one is just the concept of the master. Who is the master? Well, we're going to find out. So in the Tao Te Ching, a book written by Lao Tzu, ancient book of Taoist Chinese philosophy, it's really a book for understanding hidden virtue. It's a book for mastering oneself. It's also a book for leadership. And in it, Lao Tzu starts to reference in verse 2 this character called the master, or sometimes the Taoist. It's really, what would someone do if they were living in full realization of the Tao? How would they act? How would they behave? It's a really cool question, or it's a really cool prompt. You'll see it in a lot of different religious texts. There's parallels to in the Bhagavad Gita when Arjuna asked Krishna, you've told me about these enlightened yogis, these enlightened people. Like, okay, how would a man of enlightenment or person of enlightenment actually act in the real world? What would their mindset be? What would their actions be like? Well, we're going to start to get into that as we go deeper into the Tao Te Ching. So I'm going to read the verse first, then I'll go through stanza by stanza and kind of get into the nitty gritty. And again, we are working with the Stephen Mitchell translation, and I'm sure the academics out there may poo-poo this translation because it is more poetic in nature, but I think those who actually practice the Tao and aren't just studying it intellectually value that poeticism. So here we go. When people see some things as beautiful, others become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other. Therefore, the master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. Things arise and she lets them come. Things disappear and she lets them go. She has but does not possess. She acts but doesn't expect. When her work is done, she forgets it, and that is why it lasts forever. Okay, so first of all, just want to comment that Stephen Mitchell switches up the genders. So sometimes he uses she, sometimes he uses he, and there is really no gender. There are no pronouns in the Tao Te Ching, in the Chinese character, so it's completely up to one's translation. So he starts with this first concept, which is about the relativity of all attributes, right? When you see one thing as beautiful, you make another thing ugly. And what a lot of people don't realize, this continues on the kind of concept from the first verse of the Tao Te Ching, which talks about how words themselves are culturally created, but so are norms, so are ideas of beauty, right? In ancient times, we would have thought that a woman that was very, round and voluptuous was kind of the ideal of beauty. Now we, and maybe not so much now, but maybe when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, the very thin, kind of emaciated women were seen as the objects of beauty, right? And so when you make one thing beautiful, you make another thing ugly. The fault here is actually in making something beautiful, as saying something is here and something else is here. So when you create goods and bads, right? Goods create bads. So here's another example of way of thinking of it is when you tell your child one thing is good, you're also telling them that this other thing is bad. And unfortunately, when you tell a child that something is bad, it creates a whole taboo and a whole shadow in their mindset about that thing. And they start to feel averse to it over time, or they have to feel like they have to hide any connection to that thing over time. And as we grow up and become adults, those things that we were told are not good become part of our own shame body, part of our own pain body, and they become the things that we either subconsciously or consciously avoid. And so this whole first stanza is about kind of trying to break through that mindset of seeing things as either good or bad, as seeing people as good and others as bad. I would also add that what this is getting at, it is some people might say, well, this is arguing for moral relativism, right? If there's no good and bad. And I would argue that the Tao Te Ching as a whole does not argue that. We'll get into that later as we get deeper into the text. It does have a concept of virtue and non-virtue, but it regards morals as being socially put upon us and not coming from a natural place, and thus they create conflict, inner conflict within us. There's actually a verse later in the Tao Te Ching that says, when society loses its sense of truth, when it loses its connection to the Tao, it focuses on, being kind. When it loses kindness, it focuses on being just. And when it loses even a sense of being just, it focuses on moral rights and wrongs. And a society becomes obsessed with you're right, you're wrong. And I would actually argue that's where our society is today. But we're going to go deeper into that in another verse of the Tao Te Ching. I'll try to I'll remember what verse that is, and I'll put it in the show notes. But the premise, the earlier premise from verse 2 that we're dealing with right now is that we need to suspend our judgment about what's good and what's bad, and allow that judgment not to come from here, but to come from a full embodied place. We'll talk about that later as well. The second stanza says, being and non-being create each other, difficult and easy. Remember, these are all the opposites. It was just saying something and then giving you its opposite and showing how these two opposites are what bring those into existence, right? You can't have long if you don't have short. And this is the real kicker. If I, hold up a piece of chocolate, we can say, this is a long piece of chocolate. That's because normally maybe you're used to seeing a piece of chocolate that's about that big, right? But if I could go down to the electron microscope level, like even the tiniest speck of chocolate, would be vastly longer. Like it can get infinitely shorter, right? In fact, we don't even know how short something can get. Every time we think we find the end, right? We think electrons are the smallest thing, or we think protons are the smallest things, and then we find muons and gluons, and there's all these subatomic particles that science keeps finding when it tries to go smaller. As well, things can get vastly bigger, right? The universe, as far as we know, is infinite. So you've got this infinitely large and infinitely small universe, and therefore you have an infinite universe, and therefore anything that you would use to describe anything is simply in relation to something else. And when you describe one of those things as good and one of those things as bad in any situation, or you ascribe being here is better than being here, then you're kind of talking about something that is meaningless, because you could be infinitely higher or infinitely lower on that spectrum. Let me say this in another way. This came to me during a very powerful meditation that I was having last summer. And I was sitting in meditation, and I was contemplating, I was experiencing the peace of sitting in meditation. Now, for some people, meditation is not peaceful because maybe your body is uncomfortable. Maybe you have back pain. Maybe you have a lot of thoughts. Maybe you haven't learned to meditate yet. You haven't learned to circulate your energy yet. So meditation is not pleasurable. But even for someone like for me, my meditation is probably a lot more pleasurable than it was in my own body, say 10 years ago because of practice, or maybe infinitely more pleasurable than someone who can't sit still because their body and mind just feel like they're full of garbage all the time. That being said, even in the moment that I'm experiencing this pleasurable meditation, I had, itches. There were mosquitoes biting me. It was the summertime. I was out by a lake. There were things causing discomfort. And then my mind did this interesting insight, which was, okay, how could I make this even more uncomfortable? And so I imagined, what if there were like 100 mosquitoes biting me at once? That would be terrible. Okay, but then I imagined, what if there were like 1,000,000 mosquitoes biting me at once? Okay, then I imagine, I could be tied up and I could be put in a more uncomfortable position. Like I could keep coming up with in my mind worse and worse experiences. And literally, the hell realms that I could have entered were infinite. On top of that, why am I sitting there meditating? Am I not meditating to try to feel some bliss? This is a kind of a foolish concept that a lot of yogis and meditators have, or people have, about meditation. We think the purpose to meditate is to experience bliss, is to experience this high enlightened state of consciousness, this ultimate, think of the opposite of being eaten by 1,000 mosquitoes, right? We're thinking like our whole goal of spiritual practice is to have this amazing enlightening experience. And that's why people do psychedelics and they do all these things. Like they think that if they have that experience that's so high, then everything will be better for the rest of their life. And in fact, I had that mindset before. But in this moment that I was having this insight, I realized that just like the negative could be infinite, the positive could also be infinite. And the experience that I was having right then and there, wherever I was in the middle of it all, was infinitely more blissful than the worst hell realms that could exist. And so that there's really no need for me to go any higher or any lower. And any concept that one has, that you have, that's more good and that's more bad, and that where I am right now, I need to head towards the good, all of that is creating suffering. And so when you realize that everything, all of yin and yang are, relative to one another, in that moment, you can let go of the need to be anywhere but where you are. And so this second verse is talking about, when to notice that, start to see that in your life. And after introducing those two ideas, so the idea about kind of judging things as good or bad, or judging or noticing that everything is relative on a scale, then it says in the last stanza, therefore the master or the Taoist acts without doing anything. Another translation, it'll say, dwells in non-action, right? In other words, it's not that they sit and do nothing, just sit on their ass all day. It's that they don't have to strive for anything to be different than it already is, and teaches without saying anything. No, I can't say I'm embodying that one. So the master acts without doing anything, or acts by dwelling in non-action, and teaches without saying anything. How I like to think of that line is when I think about what with my kids. what I notice with my kids, at least, and maybe you'll have noticed this, is that if I try to tell my son, like I brought him skiing for the first time the other day, if I try to tell him what to do with his skis, it's like there's like a wall, right? But if I let him fall, if I let him ski, if I just get him on the mountain and let him do it, I create the space for him to learn. So like the less force that you bring into a situation, the Taoists, when the Taoist teaches, they try to teach with minimal force. They try to teach by allowing. My son commented me, and we did about 7 runs, and he got, in the beginning, I was really nervous. I was skiing backwards in front of him. So that all he could see is me looking down the mountain. And he said, I don't like that. And so then I just skied a little in front of him and said, you can follow me if you want, and let him, barrel down the hill. But over time, like the more I stopped trying to teach and just created the space to allow the other him to be there, the more powerful it was. And so the master, when you think about your own life, you can think about when you're trying to navigate through life, you have certain dharmas or jobs. So me as a father, part of my job in life is raising these children, right? This is, assigned from heaven, right? Assigned from the universe. These people came out of me. I feel compelled to raise them. And so the more I can do that without forcing, the more in alignment with the Tao I become. So things arise and she lets them come. Things disappear and she lets them go. So now you don't have to think about having children. You might think about just your relationships with friends or with loved ones or with anyone. Like when, things arise, right? Like conflict will arise. Do you let it come or do you try to stop it before it gets to you? When things come out of your life, do you let them go or do you cling to them? People that live in a constant state of trying to stop conflict from coming and trying to cling to something from the past, they live in a constant state of anxiety. They live in a constant state of non-Tao, non-day. So the master, she has things, but she doesn't possess. She acts, but doesn't expect. So a Taoist master isn't living in a cave by themselves somewhere. They're just normal people. But they know that everything in life could be taken away from them at any moment. So you can be rich and be a Taoist. You can be poor and be a Taoist. But the key is you're holding on to things in life, but you're not squeezing. You're loosening your grip on things so that if you have to put it down, you can put it down. When her work is done, she forgets it. And that is why it lasts forever. And so this last concept is an interesting one because I think a lot of people are attached to the work they do in the world. Either they're paralyzed by fear about putting out something into the world or some work, or they want it to be perfect, or they kind of want to get credit for things, right? So they're constantly living in this state of wanting validation for the work or the things that they're doing in the world. But a Taoist master doesn't give a shit about all that. They've dropped the need for validation. And they're just moving. And what that does is it allows you to be so much more in the flow because you can just do things without worrying about it. I remember one of my spiritual teachers is Dharma Mitra. And he would teach, he's a yoga teacher in New York City in his 80s. And he would just teach these classes and he would like give away all the teachings, like on a Wednesday night, like all the deepest teachings. Instead of other spiritual groups that I've seen, it would be like, if you wanted to learn these teachings, you have to sign up for some very expensive workshop, you know? And there's this concept that, you have to kind of hoard them and protect these teachings. Whereas Dharma Mitra, I've always felt like he's just constantly giving the truth in every lecture that he taught. And therefore the truth would just keep flowing through him. And you also see this with creative types. You'll see there are creative people who think they have to like hoard their ideas. And like in the entrepreneurial world too, though, people like, you have to sign an NDA for this or an NDA for that. And it's like, if you're really creating something and building something and just doing it, it will speak for itself. And so when you're living as a Taoist, when you're trying to just live in the flow, you're letting go of the attachment to the results of your work, and you're just letting the work speak for itself. These teachings parallel those in the Vedic teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna says, it is better, to do your duty without any attachment to the fruit of the action, right? You are entitled to the action. You're entitled to your duty, but you are not entitled to the result. That is up to God. And so it's a similar concept, although there is kind of no kind of God concept in the Tao Te Ching. In fact, they are gonna reference heavenly God in a later chapter or later verse, but you're gonna see that the Tao is even beyond that as a concept. So we'll get into that a little later. And the last thing I want to say is that that last verse, when the Taoist's work is done, he or she forgets it, and that is why it lasts forever. Another translation by Magister Lu, which is an early mid-century Chinese translation, he would say that that is why he never loses energy. So in other words, when the work is done, he forgets it. And that is why he never loses energy or chi. And so this idea, when you're just acting in a way that is in the flow, then you don't lose any life force. When you are protecting yourself, guarding yourself, like when you're being a politician with your words, when you're overthinking and overanalyzing self, it actually takes up energy because it restricts and blocks your energy fields, and it blocks you from just being in the flow. So that's verse 2. The big key teachings are that there is this character called the ideal, the master. We're going to learn more about him or her as we go. And there is this practice called Wu Wei, or non-action. And we're going to learn how to embody that more as we go. So thank you again for listening. It is, as always, a pleasure. And see you in the next dregs. Peace.